The whispers started before she even clocked in. That nurse. The one who doesn't belong. The one Dr. Pierce had already decided was a liability, though he hadn't told her yet. They didn't know she'd already survived worse than anything Seattle General could offer. They didn't know her hands had steadied under fire at 9,000 feet in the Hindu Kush, holding pressure wraps while helicopters screamed overhead. They just saw a woman who kept her head down, who moved through hallways like she was trying to disappear into the walls, who never made eye contact during rounds. Danielle Ross arrived at Seattle General at 6:22 a.m. on a Tuesday, 16 minutes before shift change. The parking lot smelled like diesel exhaust and wet concrete. Rain had hammered the asphalt all night, and puddles reflected the pre-dawn darkness like scattered mirrors. She sat in her 10-year-old Honda Civic for exactly 4 minutes, her hand on the steering wheel, her other hand touching the small faded patch sewn deep inside her jacket lining, the one nobody would ever see unless they knew to look. The patch was olive green, threadbare at the edges, with a single insignia that meant everything she'd left behind. She touched it every morning before rounds. Ritual. Grounding. Reminder. The ICU doors opened with a pneumatic hiss as she pushed through, her badge clipped to her scrubs at chest height, her shoes already squeaking against the linoleum in that particular way that meant she'd been in hospitals long enough to know which floors needed refinishing. The cardiac unit occupied the east wing of Seattle General's intensive care section, a maze of 17 beds separated by curtains that never quite closed all the way, monitors beeping in a constant arrhythmic symphony, the air thick with antiseptic and fear sweat from families who'd been told their loved ones were dying and there was nothing to do but wait. She was invisible here, and that was exactly how she preferred it. Danielle moved through the unit with practiced efficiency, checking on her assigned patients before the official morning rounds began. 6:51 a.m. Bed 4, 68-year-old male, post-cab, day 4, vital signs stable. She adjusted his foredrip, her hand steady as surgical lasers, moving with the kind of unconscious precision that came from holding lives together across 3 continents and 12 years of service. But her shoulders were hunched slightly inward, as if she were trying to compress her frame into something smaller, less noticeable. Her voice, when she spoke to patients, was soft. Deferential. Please and thank you and I apologize for the discomfort. Never commanding. Never demanding. Just a nurse. Just another set of hands in the rotating cycle of people trying to keep people alive. The break room coffee tasted like burnt plastic, which meant it had been sitting since the night shift. She didn't mind. She drank it anyway, standing at the counter, her eyes on the clock. 6:58 a.m. 2 minutes until Dr. Marcus Pierce arrived for morning rounds, and when he did, everything would shift into a different kind of precision, the kind where one wrong word could unravel 3 months of careful invisibility. Pierce entered the unit at exactly 7:44 a.m., his white coat pristine, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, his expression the kind of controlled authority that comes from knowing you've never been questioned. He was 52, with silver threading his dark hair, the kind of handsome that made people defer to him without thinking about why. He'd been running the cardiac unit at Seattle General for 9 years, and in that time, he'd built something that looked like an empire from the outside, efficient, profitable, successful. What nobody talked about was the cost, the suppliers he favored, the kickbacks that came in the form of expanded budgets and new equipment and the kind of leverage that made people afraid to ask questions. He didn't notice Danielle at first. She was the kind of person designed not to be noticed. Morning rounds began at 7:15 a.m. with the team assembling at the Central Nurses Station. There were 6 of them, Pierce, 2 resident physicians, 3 floor nurses including Danielle, and 1 cardiac sonographer. The morning was routine, patient histories, vital sign reviews, treatment plans for the day. Pierce moved through each bed with the confidence of someone accustomed to being right, and his team moved with him in a kind of synchronized orbit, responding to his questions, confirming his decisions, never contradicting. Until Danielle did. Bed 9 was a 44-year-old female, admitted 3 days ago with acute decompensated heart failure. Her central line kit had been from MedStar Supplies, the same vendor that Pierce had been using for the past 18 months. As the team reviewed her chart, Danielle noted 3 failed attempts at line placement that morning before one finally took. She'd assisted with the insertion. She'd felt the resistance in the first 2 kits, the subtle resistance that meant something in the manufacturing wasn't right. And when Pierce asked if there were any concerns with the patient's care, Danielle spoke. Her voice was quiet. Careful. The voice of someone trying not to make waves. 3 defective central line kits this week. All MedStar brand. The failure rate seems elevated. She paused, then added the suggestion that would change everything. We might consider switching vendors. St. Luke's is using Critimed. Their complication rates are better documented. The room went dead silent. Pierce's hand stopped moving on the patient's chart. His jaw tightened, not visibly to anyone who didn't know what to look for, but Danielle saw it. She always noticed things. Details. The shift in someone's breathing. The way their pupils dilated when adrenaline spiked. The tiny muscular tells that meant a decision had been made. The supplier relationship is my responsibility, not yours, Ms. Ross. His voice was steady, almost pleasant. But something underneath it had changed, hardened, become something sharp. MedStar has provided consistent service at a competitive rate. If you're experiencing specific defects, document them through the proper channels and submit them to materials management. But I don't need input on vendor selection from the bedside staff. The words weren't cruel. That was what made them worse. They were professional, measured, the kind of correction that left no room for appeal, no space for the person being corrected to push back without looking insubordinate. He turned away from her, back to the patient, back to his rounds, and the team followed him like satellites pulled back into orbit. Danielle said nothing else. She didn't flinch. Didn't flush. Didn't look away when he glanced back at her. Her composure held because it had been forged in places where mistakes meant people died, where emotion was a liability, where the difference between surviving and not surviving was learning to keep your face completely neutral while everything inside you catalogued threats. But she'd made a mistake. She'd stepped outside her designated invisibility. And Dr. Marcus Pierce, who'd built his quiet empire on supplier kickbacks and the kind of leverage that made people afraid, had just identified her as a problem that needed solving. The rounds continued through the remaining 14 beds. Pierce's confidence never wavered. If anything, he seemed energized, moving with a kind of purposeful determination that came from having a target. He asked more questions than usual, made more decisions, spent more time at each bedside. He was performing, she realized. He was showing his team and his patients and anyone paying attention that he was the undisputed authority here, that challenges to his judgment were met with professional dismissal, that questioning his decisions was not just incorrect but unnecessary. By 8:38 a.m., rounds were finished. The team dispersed to their various tasks, residents heading to the cafeteria, the sonographer returning to her machines, the other floor nurses scattering to their assigned patients. Danielle stayed at the nurse's station, documenting the MedStar defect incidents in the official system, each entry timestamped and logged with the same precise attention she gave to everything. 8:34 a.m., Central Line Kit number 7743, defect noted during insertion, line placement failed, secondary insertion required using alternate supplier. 8:37 a.m., Central Line Kit number 7751, similar manufacturing defect, required replacement before successful placement. She was making the record official. Creating documentation. This was how you protected yourself in institutional settings. You created a paper trail that proved you'd done things the right way, that you'd followed protocol, that any consequences that came later couldn't be blamed on negligence. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 10:14 a.m., when Danielle walked into the break room for her scheduled break and found 4 other nurses sitting at the main table, all of them with lunch containers and coffee cups and that particular atmosphere that meant they'd been having a conversation. They looked up when she entered. Her colleagues. People she'd worked side by side with for 3 months, people who'd complimented her technical skills during night shifts, people she'd covered for when they called in sick. When she sat down at the table, the only empty chair, at the far end, away from their group, something shifted. One nurse stood up. Then another. They gathered their lunches, their coffee cups, their things, and they left. All of them. Within 90 seconds, Danielle was alone at the table in a room that still smelled like microwaved lasagna and burnt coffee. She sat there. Still. Completely composed. She ate her sandwich, turkey and Swiss on wheat bread, and drank her water, and her face revealed nothing. But her hands told a different story. Her right hand, the one holding the fork, whitened at the knuckles, the pressure increasing until the fork bent slightly, until she made herself release it. Muscle memory. Not fear. Restraint. The kind of controlled fury that comes from recognizing a pattern you've seen before, the systematic isolation, the professional humiliation, the careful removal of support systems before the real attack begins. They didn't know. None of them knew. But Dr. Pierce had called them before rounds. He'd pulled them aside, just for a moment, and suggested that the new staff member was competent but potentially difficult, that she might be having issues adjusting to the unit, that they should be careful about her judgment. He hadn't said anything direct. Just implications. Suggestions. The kind of language that made people protective of themselves, that made them retreat, that turned colleagues into obstacles instead of allies. The Henderson family's room smells like flowers and antiseptic, a combination that catches in the back of the throat like a warning. Mr. Henderson sits propped at 45 degrees, his chest bandaged beneath the hospital gown, 3 days post-op from the triple bypass that should have killed him. Should have. The monitor beside his bed tracks his heart in green waves, steady rhythm, the kind of sinus pattern that makes recovery possible. His wife holds a cup of coffee she's been holding for an hour without drinking. Their daughter sits in the vinyl chair, phone in her lap, eyes tracking the morphine drip like it might suddenly betray them all. Dr. Pierce enters the room at 9:51 a.m. with the kind of entrance that announces itself before his shoes touch the tile. White coat perfectly pressed. Stethoscope draped across his shoulders like a medal. 3 residents trailing behind him, pens poised above clipboards, ready to transcribe whatever wisdom their superior is about to dispense. Danielle finishes charting at the foot of the bed, her handwriting precise, economical, the kind of notation that says everything in the minimum number of words. Mr. Henderson, how are we feeling this morning? Pierce's voice carries the smooth confidence of someone who has never once questioned whether the world should listen to him. He moves to the bedside, and Danielle steps back, giving him space, the way the protocol demands. Better, Mr. Henderson says, though his voice is thin, reedy, the voice of someone whose body is still negotiating with trauma. Less pain than yesterday. Pierce nods approvingly and reaches for the monitor, the bedside cardiac monitor, a GE Dynamap unit that's been beeping steadily since 6 a.m. rounds. His hand is still 3 inches from the device when the alarm shrieks. Not a gentle chime. A shriek. The kind of sound that travels down the hallway and makes people move faster, speak louder, assume the worst. The monitor screen flashes. Asystole. No heartbeat. Nothing. Mrs. Henderson's cup of coffee slips from her fingers and shatters on the tile floor. The smell of it, bitter, cold, spreads across the linoleum. The daughter makes a sound that isn't quite a word. Danielle moves. Not fast. Efficient. She's at the bedside in 2 steps, her hand on Mr. Henderson's carotid artery, checking for pulse. Strong. Steady. Still there. His eyes are open. His chest is moving. His color is normal. Everything about him screams that he's alive. He's fine, she says quietly. Check his hand. The monitor leads are disconnected. Not unplugged from the patient, unplugged from the monitor itself. The wiring. The faulty wiring that has been causing intermittent connections for the past 72 hours. This is the 3rd alarm. The 3rd false code. The 3rd time the equipment from Pierce's preferred supplier has decided that a living, breathing man is dead. But Pierce is already turning to the Hendersons, his expression shifting into something that looks like concern but carries the weight of blame. I apologize for Nurse Ross's failure to properly maintain equipment, he says, his voice dropping into the register reserved for serious conversations with family members. This kind of negligence is exactly why we have protocols. This is exactly why we don't improvise. He glances at the monitor, at Danielle, at the residents scribbling notes on their clipboards. I'll be ordering a full equipment check on this unit. We need to understand what happened here. Danielle's jaw clenches. Once. A muscle rippling along the hinge of her jaw, visible for half a heartbeat before she releases it. Her expression returns to its baseline, neutral, composed, the face of someone whose internal landscape is entirely separate from the world watching her. She reaches up to the monitor lead, the one that's been disconnected, and reseats it into the jack. The screen stabilizes. Sinus rhythm returns. Normal. Regular. Alive. Equipment malfunction, she says, her voice level. Not protocol failure. I'll document it. But Pierce is already moving toward the door, his entourage following like remoras behind a shark. He doesn't acknowledge her response. He doesn't need to. The message has been delivered. The family has heard it. The residents have written it down. By lunch, half the hospital will have heard some version of it. The nurse who broke protocol, the nurse whose negligence nearly killed a patient, the nurse who doesn't understand the way things work. Mrs. Henderson pulls her hand away when Danielle reaches to check her husband's vitals again. The movement is small but definite. A flinch. A decision. The second strike comes at 2:15 p.m. The unit's disciplinary board lives in the main hallway, the artery of the ICU, the place where every staff member, visitor, and family member passes multiple times per shift. It's white, laminated, professional. It has Danielle's name on it in blue dry erase marker, printed in block letters that don't blur or fade. Ross, failure to follow protocol, unauthorized suture selection. No context. No explanation. Just accusation mounted in public the way a hunter mounts a trophy. The message is surgical, she doesn't follow orders. She can't be trusted. She decides what she wants to do instead of what the doctor wants her to do. The reality is simpler. Pierce had ordered the use of a specific brand of surgical sutures, an expensive brand from his preferred supplier, the same supplier whose equipment keeps malfunctioning. During a routine dressing repair on a trauma patient at 11:13 a.m., those sutures had run out. Mid-procedure. Danielle had grabbed the alternative brand from the emergency supply, completed the repair, and documented it in the patient's chart, as protocol actually requires. The repair itself had been textbook perfect. The wound was secure. The dressing was stable. The patient was fine. But she had done it without permission. She had made a decision based on patient care instead of waiting to ask the doctor. She had prioritized the patient's immediate need over the chain of command. Nurses pass the board and their eyes slide away from it like it's contaminated. One pretends to read her phone, her gaze stuck on a screen she's not really seeing. Another notices the board, notices Danielle standing near the medication cart, and turns to walk the opposite direction without breaking stride. A third starts to read the message aloud to a colleague, then catches herself, closes her mouth, and keeps walking. The message is clear: this woman is not safe. This woman breaks rules. This woman will cost you if you're seen with her. By the time lunch rolls around at 12:44 p.m., the isolation is complete. Danielle sits at the break room table with a sandwich and a cup of water. Turkey, mustard, wheat bread. The kind of lunch that suggests someone who eats to survive rather than someone who takes pleasure in food. The break room is painted a shade of beige that hospitals seem to manufacture specifically to sap the color from faces. Fluorescent lights buzz overhead with the kind of low-frequency hum that makes teeth ache after prolonged exposure. 3 nurses are already at the table when she enters: Sarah, who works the night shift and stays late sometimes, Marcus, who has been in the ICU for 8 years, and Patricia, who trained Danielle during her first week. They're mid-conversation about a patient case, their voices animated, comfortable. They see Danielle. The conversation doesn't pause, but something shifts. Sarah's shoulders tense. Marcus glances at Patricia. Danielle pulls out a chair and sits. The silence that follows isn't the absence of sound. It's something more active, more deliberate. It's the kind of silence that requires effort to maintain. Sarah gathers her leftovers without finishing her meal. Marcus folds his napkin, carefully, precisely, and stands. Patricia watches them go, then follows, her yogurt spoon left on the table like evidence of abandonment. Within 90 seconds, 3 people have left. 30 seconds later, a group of 2 nurses who had entered just as Danielle was sitting stands and takes their trays to a different table. Then they stand again and leave the break room entirely. Then the person sitting alone at the 3rd table gathers her things and exits. The break room is large. It seats 20. 20 open chairs. 20 empty places. And Danielle, eating her sandwich, her water untouched, her face revealing nothing. Her knuckles whiten around the edge of the table where her right hand grips. Just slightly. Just for 3 seconds. Then she releases it. Her hand returns to picking up her sandwich. She takes a bite. Chews. Swallows. Her face remains blank, the face of someone watching traffic move past a window, uninvested, untouched. Around her, the fluorescent lights continue their mechanical humming. The shift ends at 4 p.m., but Danielle stays until 4:16 to complete the end-of-shift charting for her 3 patients. The unit is quieter now, the frenetic energy of the day's shift giving way to the different rhythm of evening rounds. She documents vitals, medications, patient responses, the small details that make up the medical narrative of survival or decline. At 4:51 p.m., she pulls the faded unit patch from the inside lining of her jacket. It's small, 4 inches by 3 inches, embroidered in colors that have faded to near invisibility, a silver dagger overlaid with a lightning bolt. Special Forces insignia. The kind of patch that takes 18 months and 180 days of continuous operational deployment to earn the right to wear. The kind of patch that represents something that most people will never understand about strength, about capability, about what happens when you survive the unsurvivable. She looks at it. Her eyes are steady. Her breathing is steady. She tucks it back into the lining and button her jacket. What she doesn't know, what she can't know, is that Dr. Pierce is on his phone in his office 3 floors above, talking to someone named Castellano who sits on the hospital board. Castellano owes Pierce a favor from a real estate deal that went sideways 8 years ago. The favor has been collecting interest ever since. "I'm concerned about a pattern of concerning behavior," Pierce is saying, his voice smooth, his tone the exact right mixture of professional worry and personal alarm. Nothing overt. Nothing we can prove yet. But she's showing instability, unpredictability. And there's something else, she's asking unusual questions about the new trauma patient. The one with the industrial accident. He pauses. "I think she needs to be reviewed. Closely." Castellano listens. Castellano believes him. Castellano already knows what kind of person Pierce is. He's the type who gets things done, the type who makes money, the type who solves problems. If Pierce is worried, there's probably a reason. But that phone call hasn't happened yet in Danielle's timeline. She doesn't know the trap is being set. She doesn't know that her quiet questions about the shrapnel patient, her patient, the one she was specifically deployed here to observe, have just triggered the mechanism that will destroy her career. What she does know is that the break room is empty. That the board in the hallway carries her name like a scarlet letter. That tomorrow she'll return to work knowing that every conversation she has, every decision she makes, is being watched with a specific intensity reserved for people who have broken the rules. She doesn't know yet that breaking the rules is exactly what she's about to be forced to do. The admitting desk called at 2:17 p.m. Trauma case. Industrial accident, the paperwork said. Shrapnel wound to the left anterior chest, fragmentation pattern consistent with a machinery malfunction at a construction site in South San Antonio. The chart was neat, documented, and completely false. Danielle knew the difference between industrial fragmentation and IED fragmentation the way a sommelier knows the difference between a 2005 Burgundy and a counterfeit. The wound geometry didn't match a press brake or a shearing machine. It matched a 155mm artillery round detonated in an enclosed space. Hindu Kush Valley, maybe. Or Cunha Province. The angles told her everything. She didn't react when she read the intake summary. Didn't exchange a glance with the charge nurse. Didn't let her jaw tighten for even the fractional second it took her nervous system to recognize that someone, somewhere, knew she was here. Her hands didn't shake as she pulled on fresh gloves. Her breathing remained steady, measured, the rhythm of someone who had been trained to metabolize adrenaline the way normal people metabolized coffee. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Pure, disciplined restraint. The patient arrived in Bay 7, wheeled in by two paramedics who looked wrung out and professional. Mid-50s, weathered hands, the kind of hands that had worked in unforgiving environments for decades. His chart listed him as Marcus Webb, independent contractor, no emergency contact listed. He was conscious and in moderate pain, his breathing shallow but adequate, oxygen saturation holding at 94% on room air. The wound itself was a 6-centimeter laceration just below the left clavicle, bleeding controlled but still seeping that slow arterial drip that meant deeper tissue damage. The paramedics had applied a field dressing, basic gauze and tape, competent but incomplete. Danielle glanced at the monitor. Heart rate 102. Blood pressure 118/71, dropping. The body compensating, pulling blood from the periphery, preparing for something worse. She moved to the bedside and began her assessment with the precision of someone who had done this exact procedure in a forward operating base with incoming fire less than 200 meters away. She didn't hurry. Hurrying meant mistakes. She exposed the wound, peeled back the dressing, and saw what she already knew was there. The damage extended deeper than the laceration suggested. Fragmentation had tunneled through tissue, creating a wound track that followed the path of least resistance through muscle and connective tissue. The kind of injury that required not just closure but reconstruction. She called for the wound care kit, the one with the specific sutures and the hemostatic gauze that Pierce had flagged as unnecessary expense. She assembled everything on the sterile field with movements that were economical, efficient, practiced. Each motion flowed into the next without hesitation or doubt. Her hand steady as a surgical laser. "I'm going to clean this out and get you stitched up," she said to the patient, her voice level and calm. "You're doing fine. You're stable." Marcus Webb turned his head slightly, studying her face for the first time. His eyes were the color of faded denim, and something in them shifted. Recognition, maybe. Or calculation. She returned to the wound, beginning the irrigation with normal saline, watching the debris emerge in the flow, not dirt, not rust, but fragments of something harder. Mineral dust. Geological. The kind of dust that clung to you after an explosion in rocky terrain, that you could taste for weeks, that reminded you of every breath you'd taken in that place. She worked methodically. The needle decompression technique she used was taught in field medicine courses that didn't officially exist. The pressure wrap she applied used a specific tension pattern that kept the wound from reopening while allowing sufficient blood flow to prevent tissue death. She had learned it from a master sergeant in Bagram, a man who had kept soldiers alive through 53 separate casualty evacuations. The technique was subtle enough that it looked almost like standard dressing protocol. Almost. It would have been invisible to most ICU nurses. But it wasn't invisible to someone who had learned it the same way. She was taping the final corner of the dressing when the patient in the adjacent bed shifted his weight. Bay 6 held a man in his early 60s, transport driver, admitted 3 days ago with pneumonia that had escalated to sepsis. He'd been sedated, ventilated, his own private battle with infection running in parallel to everything else happening in this unit. But something had brought him to enough consciousness to notice. His eyes were open now, tracking her movements with the fixed intensity of someone who understood exactly what he was seeing. "Hindu Kush, right?" The words came out rough, his voice abraded from the ventilator tube they'd removed that morning. "I'd recognize that pressure wrap anywhere." The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped in the distance. A crash cart rattled past someone's room. All normal sounds. All part of the ambient noise of an ICU in the middle of an ordinary Thursday. Danielle finished taping the last corner of the dressing and straightened, her face neutral, her posture unchanged. She didn't meet his eyes. Not yet. Not when the charge nurse was still within line of sight, not when the attending physician could walk past at any moment, not when every micro-expression mattered. She gathered the used supplies into the biohazard container, each movement deliberate and unhurried. The sharps container received the used needle with a soft click. The soiled gauze crumpled into the trash. The suture package folded and discarded. All the theater of standard ICU cleanup. No one watching her would have seen anything except a competent nurse finishing a dressing change with professional efficiency. No one would have seen the slight pause in her breathing. No one would have noticed that her left hand had unconsciously moved to the inside of her scrub jacket, where the faded unit patch was sewn into the lining, where it had lived hidden for 2 years. "Vitals are stable," she said to Marcus Webb, her voice pitched for him alone. "Rest now. Let the medication work." She turned away from Bay 6 and moved toward the supply closet, her gait unchanged, her posture straight. Her mind, however, was running through calculus problems that had no good answers. Someone in this ICU knew what she was. Knew where she had been. Knew the difference between a field dressing and a standard field dressing. The knowledge was a physical thing, a weight settling in her chest alongside something else. Something that felt like recognition. Something that felt like a countdown had just started. The supply closet was blessedly empty. She stepped inside and reached for the extra 4 bags that hung on the wall, unnecessary supplies that gave her a legitimate reason to be here instead of at the nursing station. Her hand found the faded patch through the fabric of her jacket. She didn't pull it out. Didn't look at it. Just let her fingers rest against it for 2 seconds, 2 seconds of contact with something that represented 18 months of undercover work, 3 months of vetting, 2 years of becoming invisible. The Hindu Kush. That meant Hindu Kush. That meant Paktia province, probably, or Loga. That meant this man had been in theater. That meant this man had either been military or had spent enough time around military to learn field medicine techniques that the civilians never saw. That meant the cover that had held so carefully, so completely, for 24 months had just developed a fracture with someone's name etched right into it. She left the supply closet and returned to the nursing station, where the charge nurse was updating the shift log and the resident was reviewing labs on the computer screen. Everything normal. Everything routine. She logged the dressing change, documented the vitals, noted the patient's stable status. Her typing was precise. Her documentation was flawless. Her hands did not betray anything that her voice would not confirm. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Marcus Webb in Bay 7 had arrived with a chart that didn't match his injuries. The worst part was that the paramedics who brought him in looked like they'd been trained on things other than emergency response. The worst part was that as Danielle pulled up his complete intake information on the computer, she found himself staring at a blank field where his emergency contact should have been, and instead of a name there was a single line of text that read, "Classified military attachment." 3 minutes later, her secure phone, the one that lived at the bottom of her locker in the employee break room, the one that was supposed to be a classified Pentagon direct line used only for emergency extraction, vibrated once. She didn't check it immediately. That would have drawn attention. Instead, she finished her charting, helped another patient to the bathroom, answered a call light in Bay 3. All routine. All invisible. It wasn't until 3:42 p.m., when she was retrieving fresh linens from the supply room, that she pulled the phone from her pocket and read the single text message that had arrived from a number with no name attached. Package secure. Do not compromise cover. Command aware of contact. Stand by for further instruction. She deleted the message immediately, her thumbs moving with the muscle memory of someone who had destroyed evidence under fire. She powered down the phone, slipped it back into her pocket, and returned to the unit carrying an armload of linens. Her face was serene. Her breathing was steady. Her mind was already running 3 steps ahead, calculating trajectories and timelines and the precise angle of a conversation that had lasted exactly 4 seconds. Marcus Webb in Bay 7 had known her techniques. Which meant someone had sent him. Which meant Command knew she had been made. Which meant everything she had built here, every painstaking moment of invisibility, every carefully constructed instance of being overlooked and underestimated, had just turned into something else entirely. Not a cover anymore. A countdown. She adjusted the linens in the supply closet and returned to her rounds, the quietest person in the room, the one no one had ever really seen, the one who had just become the most visible person in the entire ICU. The evening shift had settled into its rhythm, monitors beeping their steady electronic heartbeat, the ventilator in bed for hissing its mechanical breath, nurses moving through the ICU with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned to function in controlled chaos. Danielle was adjusting a central line placement in bed 7 when the security desk called up to announce a visitor for the trauma patient in bed 3. Nothing unusual. Visiting hours had 30 minutes left. She didn't look up from her work, her hands steady as surgical lasers as she verified the line depth on the chest X-ray mounted above the bedside monitor. The man who entered through the ICU doors 3 minutes later moved with the kind of heavy deliberation that only came from someone either severely intoxicated or carrying something they wanted to keep hidden. 6'5". Heavy wool coat despite the San Antonio heat outside. His eyes had that particular glassiness that spoke of either pills or powder, and his left hand stayed buried in his coat pocket with the kind of protective grip that made the back of Danielle's neck tighten. She had seen enough field trauma to recognize the weight distribution of someone carrying concealed ordnance. Her hands didn't change pace. She finished logging the line placement and moved toward the supply closet as if she hadn't noticed anything. The gunman stopped at bed 3 and stared at the patient lying unconscious, the shrapnel wound case, the one marked for monitoring, the reason Danielle was here. He whispered something. Then his voice rose. Then his hand came out of his pocket wrapped around a Glock 19 that he raised toward the trauma surgeon who had been standing at the bedside reviewing the chart. Narcotics. Now. Give me what you've got or I light this place up. The nurse stationed at the central monitor froze mid-keystroke. A respiratory therapist checking a ventilator setting took 3 steps backward. The trauma surgeon's hand came up slowly, palms out, the universal gesture of compliance or fear. The gun swung toward the monitor station. Toward the patient in bed 2. Toward the elderly woman in bed 5 whose daughter had been sitting vigil but was now pressed against the back wall, hand over her mouth. Danielle had already moved. 3 steps. That was all it took to close the distance. Step 1 crossed from the supply closet into the main ICU floor. Step 2 brought her into his peripheral vision. Step 3 put her inside his reaction time. Her left hand came up and struck the radial nerve at his wrist, not a punch but a precise strike to the epicondyle, fingers extended in the specific angle they had drilled 10,000 times in the Hindu Kush where nerves and pressure points meant the difference between coming home breathing and coming home in a box. The Glock dropped like he'd suddenly forgotten how to hold it. Her right hand caught his gun arm at the elbow and twisted. Supination. External rotation. His body followed his arm because the human skeleton has limits that don't care about your intentions. He went down like a felled tree, his face hitting the polished floor with a sound like a melon splitting against concrete. The wind went out of his lungs. She had his arm locked before he could draw breath, her knee in the small of his back, her grip on his wrist exact and surgical, the same grip she used to stabilize fractures, now applied to a man whose pupils were blown wide enough to show he'd probably used in the last hour. Security arrived 30 seconds later, out of breath and confused about what had happened. Danielle had already secured the weapon, placed it on the nearest empty counter, and was checking the patient in bed 3 for any signs of distress from the commotion. Her heart rate sat at a normal 72 beats per minute. Her breathing was controlled. She didn't look at the gunman being placed in restraints. Didn't look at the trauma surgeon whose hands were still shaking. The trauma surgeon stared at her like she'd just materialized from behind a curtain instead of from inside the supply closet where he'd assumed she was organizing bandages. "I'm calling it in," security said into their radio, their voice tight and urgent. Danielle was already documenting the patient's status in real time, her fingers moving across the tablet with mechanical precision. Oxygen sat at 94%. Heart rate stable. No cardiac involvement from the stress response. She pulled up the incident log and marked the time, 6:48 p.m. The gunman was still gasping on the floor, his consciousness slowly returning to the understanding that his wrist felt like it was on fire and his ability to cause harm had just become completely irrelevant. The police took 40 minutes to arrive. The gunman was conscious and complaining by then, which meant he was no longer a threat, just an obstacle in an already complicated evening. Danielle had finished her rounds, documented the incident with clinical precision, and was preparing the medication cart when the trauma surgeon approached her in the hallway outside the ICU. "What you did in there," he started, then stopped. Restarted. That wasn't something a nurse learns in a textbook. She didn't turn around. "I have a good memory for protocols." It wasn't a lie. Not technically. Protocols in the Hindu Kush were just more specialized. The police report was filed at 7:31 p.m. By 8:15 p.m., Pierce had already called an emergency board meeting for 9:02 a.m. the next morning. He didn't wait for the dust to settle. He didn't wait for the official investigation to conclude. He moved with the speed of someone who recognized an opportunity and had the institutional power to exploit it. The conference room on the third floor smelled like burnt coffee and the particular tension that came from hastily scheduled meetings. The board members filtered in looking confused, Dr. Hartley from cardiology, the administrator Ms. Chen, 2 community representatives, and the board chair, Gerald Matthews, who owed Pierce more favors than he could count. There was a consultant in the corner too, someone Danielle had never seen before, who had the careful neutral expression of a hired hand waiting for payment. Pierce laid out his narrative with the precision of a man who had rehearsed it multiple times in the last 12 hours. "Excessive force," he said gravely, his voice carrying the weight of professional concern. "A patient in acute psychiatric distress, clearly suffering from a mental health crisis, and she responded with violence instead of de-escalation. She could have called security. She could have stepped back. Instead, she assaulted a man who needed medical intervention, not brutality." The consultant nodded along, taking notes, a human rubber stamp waiting to be activated. Danielle sat across from them in a steel chair and said nothing. She had been told to report to the administrator's office that morning and found a hastily assembled quasi-tribunal instead. No union representative. No time to prepare. Just Pierce's narrative and her silence. Gerald Matthews leaned forward. "Captain, or Nurse Ross, I suppose. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" She could have told him the truth. Could have said that a 6'5" man waving a loaded firearm at sedated patients left zero options for verbal de-escalation, that the fastest way to save lives was to remove the threat, that every second of delay would have been a second toward a mass casualty event. Could have said that she had been trained by the United States military to assess threats at millisecond intervals and respond with exactly the level of force required to neutralize them and no more. Could have told them everything. Instead, she said, "The patients are safe." That was the priority. Pierce smiled. Which is precisely the problem. She's decided her priorities override hospital policy, override proper chain of command, override any sense of professional restraint. What if she'd broken his arm permanently? What if he'd sued? The liability exposure is enormous. The consultant made a note. Appeared to agree. The air in the room felt like it was being slowly removed, creating a vacuum that would swallow her if she didn't fill it with words. But she couldn't. The moment she identified herself as military intelligence, the moment she revealed that the trauma patient in bed 3 was a covered asset, the entire operation collapsed. 3 months of deep cover. 480 hours of documented surveillance on a weapon smuggling operation that stretched from San Antonio to Ciudad Juarez. Gone. The patient exposed. The network scrambled. Lives endangered. Months of intelligence work evaporating like morning rain on hot asphalt. She kept her mouth shut. Gerald Matthews did the paperwork himself. We're recommending immediate termination, effective today. This is a personnel file matter now. We'll need your badge, your hospital ID, and any access cards before you leave the building. She signed. Didn't read it. The words blurred anyway because her hands were shaking and she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing it, so she kept them flat on the table, steady as concrete, while the room decided she was unstable and dangerous and a liability that needed to be removed. By 3:44 p.m. on a Tuesday, she was walking out through the employee entrance with a sealed envelope containing her termination letter and the particular kind of silence that comes from having everything removed in a single coordinated strike. Her son was at the kitchen table when she arrived home. 16 years old. Taking dual-credit college courses. Watching his mother walk through the front door 3 hours before her usual time, on a shift she never missed, her scrubs rumpled and her hands steady but her shoulders curved like she was carrying something invisible and extremely heavy. Mom? You're home early. You never come home early. What happened? She sat down across from him and couldn't answer. The tears came without permission, without dignity, without the kind of control she had maintained for 18 years of military service and 3 years undercover. They came like a dam break. Like someone had finally found the pressure relief valve in the back of her skull and opened it all the way. Her son didn't understand. How could he? He knew his mother as a nurse who loved her work, who never missed a shift, who held people together in their worst moments. He didn't know about the Hindu Kush. Didn't know about the 17 lives she'd saved with needle decompression under fire. Didn't know that the carefully folded uniform in the back of her closet came with a rank, a unit, a legacy of service that had just been erased by a man more concerned with kickbacks than with the truth. I can't tell you what happened, she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry. I can't. He sat there, 16 years old and completely helpless, watching his unbreakable mother break into pieces on a Tuesday afternoon while the son moved across the kitchen and neither of them spoke because there were no words that could fit in this particular kind of silence. His mother had stopped trembling by the time the son touched the kitchen window again. She hadn't moved from the table except to exhale, slow, deliberate breaths that sounded like someone learning to live again. Her son Marcus sat across from her, 16 and terrified in a way that no teenager should ever have to be, watching a woman he'd never seen break turn into someone he didn't recognize. She had one hand wrapped around a cold coffee cup. The other rested flat on the table, palm down, as if pressing herself into the earth to keep from floating away. Neither of them had spoken since yesterday's phone call. Neither of them knew how to say what needed saying. The weight of her lost job hung between them like a third person at the table, taking up all the oxygen. Everything she'd built, the invisible shield of competence, the armor of keeping her head down, the certainty that if she just worked hard enough and said nothing, she could survive anything, had shattered in a single afternoon when Dr. Pierce had decided her existence was inconvenient. Marcus reached across the table. He didn't take her hand because he wasn't sure she could handle tenderness right now. Instead, he knocked twice on the table, a soft rhythm. Her eyes moved to his. For the first time in 18 hours, she focused on something outside her own thoughts. I'm going to bed, she had whispered last night. But she hadn't slept. He knew because he hadn't slept either, listening for the sound of her crying through the walls. It never came. That was somehow worse. The next morning, Marcus was gone before she woke. He left a note on her nightstand, I'll be back. I promise. She had read those words 30 times, trying to decode what they meant, but they remained opaque. Danielle dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, a soft grey cardigan, nothing that could be mistaken for who she really was, and sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her hands. Hands that had held hemostats and trauma shears for nearly 3 years without anyone knowing what they'd really done. Hands that had applied field medicine in valleys that didn't appear on any map. Hands that had performed a pressure wrap in a room full of medical professionals and nobody had recognized it for what it was, except one man lying in a hospital bed, broken and healing, who saw the truth because he'd done the same things in the same desert under the same moon. She had been fired for being herself and couldn't tell anyone why that self existed. At 8:22 a.m., the administrative offices at Seattle General were preparing for what was supposed to be a routine board meeting. Dr. Pierce had called it. 3 board members were present, the outside investigator who'd rubber-stamped his complaint, and the hospital administrator, a woman named Chen who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. The conference room smelled of burnt coffee and fresh photocopies. Fluorescent overheads cast that particular institutional light that makes everyone look slightly dead. Pierce was already seated at the head of the table, his expression arranged into wounded confidence, the posture of a man who was about to deliver very disappointing news about an employee who simply wasn't trustworthy. He had a presentation prepared. He had documents. He had 3 board members in his pocket. At 8:51 a.m., the security desk called up to the administrative office. "We have someone here to see the board. Minor. Says it's personal and urgent." The administrator, Chen, told them to send whoever it was up. She didn't expect it to matter. Decisions had already been made. Marcus walked through those conference room doors at 8:53 a.m. carrying a shadow box frame that was heavy enough to require both hands. It was mahogany with museum-quality UV protective glass, and inside it was the evidence of a life that couldn't have existed if she'd really been just a nurse. The medals were arranged in ascending order of prestige, smallest on the left. Bronze Star. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. And at the bottom, in a place of absolute honor, the Navy Cross. The ribbons beneath them had been folded with military precision, each corner sharp as a blade. The frame had his mother's name engraved on a brass plate, Captain Danielle Ross, United States Army Special Forces Command. He pushed past the security officer, who didn't stop him because he was a kid and kids couldn't be threats, and he walked directly into that meeting like he owned it. "Mom, they need to see these," he said, his voice steady in a way that made her heart break. He had learned that tone from her. From watching her show up to work broken and walk out intact, day after day, year after year. He set the frame down on the conference table with deliberate care, right in the center where every board member could see it. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Dr. Pierce's face went the color of old meat. His mouth opened and nothing came out for long enough that it became awkward, became pathetic, became the moment when everyone in that room understood they had been wrong about everything. The outside investigator leaned back in his chair, his rubber-stamped report suddenly very heavy in his lap. One of the board members started to reach for the frame, then stopped, as if the medals might burn her. Chen stood up. Just stood up, slowly, and her eyes went to the conference room door. That's when Marcus heard the voice from the hallway. It was thin and whispering, from a wheelchair, from a man who wasn't supposed to be out of bed. The combat medic patient from the ICU, the one with the shrapnel wounds that matched his own memories of Hindu Kush valleys, had somehow made it out of the cardiac unit with a volunteer helper. He was grey with exertion and his right lung hadn't fully re-expanded since his needle decompression 3 days ago, but he'd made it here. His whisper carried anyway, the kind of careful quiet that soldiers use in places where sound could kill. Reaper 6. That was her call sign. That was the voice of someone who had served under her command in a place that didn't exist. Reaper 6 is the finest soldier I've ever seen, and the finest nurse I've ever had. The medic's hands were shaking, but his eyes were clear. Everyone in that room suddenly understood that they were looking at a real veteran, a real combat soldier, confirming something that couldn't possibly be true and yet clearly was. The administrator stepped into the hallway and came back with another man. This one was in dress blues, naval officer's uniform, Marine colonel, the kind of rank that means you've been through enough wars that peace looks like a luxury. He was tall and grey-haired and had the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He was holding a citation printed on official military letterhead, and his voice, when he began to read aloud, made the fluorescent light seem dimmer by comparison. For extraordinary heroism in combat operations, Captain Danielle Ross of the 75th Ranger Regiment voluntarily remained in direct fire position to provide emergency trauma intervention to wounded personnel, stabilizing 3 casualties despite ongoing small arms fire from elevated positions. He read the next line. Then the next. His voice carried down the hallway into the ICU, where 3 nurses heard it and started to understand. His voice carried past the respiratory therapy station. It carried into the break room where other staff members stopped what they were doing and listened to a story about a person they thought they knew. "This is irrelevant theater." Dr. Pierce's voice cracked on the word theater. He stood up, knocking his chair backward. It clattered against the wall with a sound like breaking bones. "This is character assassination. This is a conspiracy to discredit my medical judgment based on..." He didn't finish because the colonel simply continued reading, his voice never changing register, never acknowledging the interruption. "That's how you know someone's really dangerous. They don't get louder when they're disrespected. They just keep going." The colonel finished. 4.5 minutes of documented heroism, of a person who had done things that required training most nurses didn't have. He folded the citation carefully and set it on the table next to the shadow box. Then he sat down in an empty chair. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. That's when a man named Rodriguez, the hospital's IT specialist, walked in from the hallway. He was Navy veteran, 12 years of service, the kind of quiet guy who worked in the basement server room and knew everything about everyone because people forgot to notice him. He was carrying a hard drive the size of his thumb. He plugged it into the conference room monitor without asking permission and pressed play. The video started in a supply closet on sublevel 2 of Seattle General, 3 months ago, timestamp running in the corner, 2:14 p.m., June 12. Dr. Pierce was accepting an envelope from a man in a suit. Medical supply company rep. The suit was talking about volume discounts. The suits always talked about volume discounts. What they meant was kickbacks. Frame by frame, the board watched Dr. Pierce. Meeting with representatives directing nurses toward specific suppliers. An email thread where he deleted purchase orders after they were entered. Deleted them so there would be no paper trail. Every time a cheaper, equivalent product came up, Pierce had blocked its use. Every time a nurse questioned the cost, Pierce had reassigned her or written her up. The footage showed him doing exactly what he'd accused Danielle of doing, lying, manipulating, sabotaging patient care for personal profit. The video ran for 17 minutes. Nobody moved. "This footage has already been shared with the FBI's Fraud Investigation Unit," Rodriguez said quietly. His voice sounded like someone who'd been expecting to have to say this for a very long time. "The supply company you've been receiving payments from is currently under federal receivership. 3 of their executives are facing RICO charges. Your bank records have been subpoenaed. Your phone records are in federal custody." He paused. "Your lawyers are going to have a very busy month." Chen stood up again. "Dr. Pierce, I'm going to need your badge and your keys." It wasn't a request. It was a command, and Pierce heard it that way because suddenly the power structure in the room had reordered itself and he was no longer standing on the high ground. He was standing in a basement, watching a video of himself committing federal crimes while a decorated soldier sat across the table from him and a Marine colonel read citations about heroism. Pierce tried to leave. He stood up, his chair skidding backward, and he walked toward the door. 2 men in windbreakers were standing in the hallway, federal procurement fraud investigators, badges already visible. They'd been waiting. They always wait for the moment when the suspect realizes everything is over. That moment is better than any warrant. That moment tells you everything you need to know about whether you've got the right person. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the United States government and acceptance of illegal gratuities," the first investigator said. He wasn't angry. Anger would have been unprofessional. He was just reciting facts. Pierce's hands went up automatically, muscle memory from 1,000 crime shows, and they cuffed him with a kind of efficiency that made everyone in the conference room understand this wasn't a negotiation. This was a predestined endpoint that Pierce had been walking toward every time he wrote up a nurse for using better equipment. Every time he accepted an envelope. Every time he deleted a file. The board member who'd called for Danielle's termination suddenly remembered an urgent phone call he needed to make. The outside investigator quietly packed his report, the one that had rubber-stamped all of Pierce's accusations before he'd even met any witnesses, and looked for somewhere to put it that might save his own career. The hospital administrator was already making phone calls. "We're reinstating Captain Ross, effective immediately." "Yes, Captain." "The title applies." "No, there's no explanation I can give you. That wouldn't take 3 hours." She was already dialing legal. She was already calculating liability. 6 months later, someone spotted Dr. Pierce on a work release program. Orange vest, federal supervision, driving a medical supply van for the very company that had paid him kickbacks. The company was now operating under court order, assets frozen, executives in federal prison. Pierce loaded boxes under the watch of a corrections officer. He wore the orange vest like a uniform that had finally told the truth about who he actually was. No one feared him. No one took his orders. He was just a man with a criminal record, working off restitution, learning what it meant to actually work for a living instead of stealing it. At Seattle General, things had changed faster than anyone expected. New equipment suppliers, properly vetted through competitive bidding. A new cardiac unit director who actually read incident reports instead of destroying them. 3 nurses came forward with stories that had been locked inside them for years, times they'd wanted to object to Pierce's directives, times they'd known something was wrong, times they'd stayed silent because fear is a more powerful motivator than ethics. Nobody blamed them. Fear is human. Courage is choosing to speak anyway. Some of them started attending the same support group where Marcus had learned that his mother's strength wasn't in vulnerability, it was the decision to show up broken and keep going. Danielle walked into Seattle General for her first shift back with her scrubs already on, the faded Special Forces unit patch sewn directly onto the outside of her jacket now, over her heart, no longer hidden in the lining where it had lived for 2 years like a secret she'd been carrying alone. The patch was worn, color faded from desert sun and washing machine cycles, and it caught the light as she moved through the ICU. Every person who saw it understood something had shifted. The invisible nurse had become visible. The quiet woman had become a presence. The soldier had stopped pretending. Her composure hadn't changed, she moved through patient rooms with the same efficiency, the same careful attention to detail. But now when a monitor alarmed, when a family member needed guidance, when a crisis developed, people looked to her automatically. The charge nurse had already begun telling new hires, during orientation, if there's ever an emergency, stay close to Ross. She knows what to do. None of them knew exactly what that meant, but they understood it meant something significant. Her son Marcus visited during her lunch break, no longer finding her eating alone in a break room, no longer watching his unbreakable mother try not to break. 3 other nurses sat with her now, asking about her weekend like she was a person and not a pariah. They shared terrible hospital coffee and gossip and the easy normalcy of people who didn't have to pretend anymore. When new combat wounded veterans came through the ICU, and they came through regularly, they recognized her without being told. They recognized the way she moved, the way she explained procedures, the way her hands never wavered during field dressing changes. Some of them saluted. She never made them stop. That part of who she was had earned the right to exist in daylight now. As she walked toward her next patient room at the end of the shift, the charge nurse told a medical student they were training, the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together. Danielle didn't react to the comment. She just continued her rounds, moved through the ICU like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, and at the nurse's station, when nobody was watching except her son through the observation window, she allowed herself the smallest smile. If you're not already subscribed, hit that button now. And if this story about hidden strength and visible courage resonates with you, leave a comment below. Tell me about a time someone underestimated you. Tell me about the quiet warrior you know. Because the world needs to remember that real heroism often looks like showing up, doing the work, and refusing to break, even when breaking would have been justified. Thank you for watching.